In today's video, we're going to spill the beans on how much it cost us to travel across the country in our recently converted camper van. Let's get into it. Earlier this year, we took our first extended trip in our recently converted camper van. It's actually on this trip that we launched this YouTube channel, and we're about to hit the road again. As we were preparing for this next big trip, I actually looked back at the last trip to see how much we actually spent traveling across the country. And I thought this would be a really good video for those who are considering doing something similar. And if you aren't into van life, that's okay too. This video may not be for you, but stick around if you're curious how much it cost us or you want to see other creative ways to travel the world. So before we get into the actual cost of the trip, I thought I would share a little bit more information about our adventure that we took earlier this year. So our trip earlier this year was from March 13th to June 22nd. Which is 103 days. We covered 11,556 miles. We ended up crossing 35 state lines. And while we were traveling, we also visited 11 national parks. So this was our first extended trip in the van. We had previously taken a 3-week trip to the Maritimes when I was still working full-time, but this was the first time that we had ever been in the van for more than 3 weeks. And because I had left my job in February of this year, it allowed us to take a longer trip. So now that you have a little bit more context about the trip, let's get into the actual costs. And for this video, we're going to break it down into 5 categories. So those 5 expense categories are fuel, lodging or camping, so when we're paying for campgrounds, food, I forget the 4th one already. What is the 4th one? The 4th expense is experiences, and then the 5th is maintenance. So while this is a new camper van, it's about 2 years old now, we did end up paying for some repairs along our trip, and I'll tell you more about that when we get to that category. So one other important note is that this video is solely focused on the cost of the trip. While we own our van outright and don't have a loan, we do pay for a few other ancillary expenses like insurance and ongoing maintenance. If we didn't make the repairs on the trip, it's not going to be included in this video. With all of that said, let's jump into the expenses. The first expense category is fuel, and this is by far one of the largest expense categories when it comes to our trip. Although not the largest, as we'll get to later. We saw a wide range of prices of what we were paying per gallon for diesel, but it all kind of evened out. Over the length of the trip, our total cost for fuel were $2,639.77. Now when I first saw this number, I was both surprised and not surprised. I was surprised that it was so large, but then I started thinking through how many miles we actually traveled, and it kind of made sense. Now, as I said earlier, this was the first extended trip that we took in the van, and with that comes a lot of excitement and anticipation for the sights that we were going to see. And so while it was 103 days long, we really crammed in all of the activities and things that we wanted to see into those days. This meant we traveled farther distances. We drove across the country to really start our trip, and then we would drive 1 or 2 hours almost every day just to see all of the sights. If we were in the area, we weren't going to miss out on the opportunity. And so with that comes more mileage and more fuel costs. But as I said, this was our first trip and we wanted to squeeze in as much as possible. And we're happy that we did. So that's the first category. So let's go on to the next category, which is lodging and camping. Now our van is off-grid capable, which means that we have a water tank in the back and also a battery system to power everything that we could possibly imagine. It also means that we rarely have to rely on hookups when we're in campgrounds, and we can actually camp off-grid most of the time. And that's exactly what we did. And for all of you nerdy van lifers and are curious what kind of battery system we do have, we have 540 amp hours of lithium, and we have a 3000 watt inverter. We can charge our battery system from both the solar on the roof and when we're driving the van with an alternator. We still need to do that full van tour and show you all the features in this van, and we're planning to film that video on our next trip. So stay tuned for more information and a full van tour of our recently converted camper van. And if you haven't already subscribed, hit that subscribe button so that you don't miss the upcoming videos. So because it's off-grid capable, we were able to spend the majority of our time staying on free public lands. The dispersed campsites that we stayed at on free public lands were incredible. They were far greater than any run-of-the-mill campground that we stayed at for the basic necessities. And I'll include a few photos of our 3 favorite campsites on free public lands to give you a sense of what they look like. So here's the first, and then another, and then the last one. Weren't those incredible? I'm telling you, all 3 of those were stunning, and there was no cost associated with either of those. So over the course of the 103 days, we stayed in campgrounds 43 nights in total. We basically stayed in campgrounds whenever there was no better option, or when it was really convenient and saved us 1 to 2 hours of driving. The total cost for all of our campgrounds, all 43 nights, was $1,237.48. This comes out to about $12 per day, or $84 per week. I was actually very happy with this number, and it's a really low expense for housing or lodging. And again, what we learned is that we really love the dispersed camping. Not only because it's free, but often the scenery and the sights and the lack of people is far greater than any campground. The next category is food. Now this category is the one that will really surprise you. Or at least it did for me. When I first saw these numbers, I couldn't even process it. It was far greater than what I was expecting, but it makes sense when you stop and think about it. So this food category includes both restaurants and groceries. And so take groceries first. Groceries are far more expensive when you're buying them in small units, and when you're buying them from remote small markets in the middle of nowhere. And so what we found is that we were paying so much more in groceries for the same food just because of the quantity and where we were buying them. And then restaurants, we weren't trying to save as much money, we were trying to experience the trip, and so we were trying both local cuisine and we were visiting cideries along the route. Visiting new cideries and trying their cider is one of our favorite pastimes, and we aren't afraid of paying money to experience that. In fact, we visited the only cidery in Wyoming, the entire state of Wyoming, on my birthday. And that was what we did to celebrate me turning 36. And that's what we did to celebrate my birthday. So over the course of the trip, for food, we spent $3,558.62. This comes out to about $35 per day, or $241 per week. But as I said, this was so worth it to us because we got to experience a lot of local cuisine and cider. But in the future, we'll probably reduce our expenses, especially for groceries, just by planning ahead and stocking up on a little bit more food when we're in more populated areas. Let's move on to the 4th category, which is experiences. So while most of the trip was visiting national parks and other sites that didn't really require us to spend any money to access, we did spend money in a handful of areas on unique experiences. For example, we took this amazing bike ride and rented e-bikes at the Grand Canyon, and that really saved the experience at the Grand Canyon. Now, I don't know about you, if you've been to the Grand Canyon, you may have a different experience or a similar one, but our experience was that it was kind of meh. You know, we had built up the anticipation well before the trip. We were really looking forward to going to the Grand Canyon, but the thing about the Grand Canyon is that it's really hard to experience, or at least to immerse yourself in the Grand Canyon, right? Like, it's so big that it's hard to get down into, that you have to hike really far and have a really rigorous hike with a lot of elevation gain. And then 2, it's just so big that everything kind of looks the same. There's not enough unique areas, at least for me, to really make it a really awesome place to visit. Like, I don't know if I would want to go back again. But we did rent these e-bikes, and we were able to ride along the Grand Canyon. And that was pretty expensive for a day, but we got to experience it in a new way, and it really salvaged the Grand Canyon. I look back and think of that as one of the best experiences on the trip. Not the best by any means, but it was one of the best. And it actually convinced us to buy our own e-bikes after we got back from the trip. And if you've been to the Grand Canyon and had a much better experience, let me know in the comments, because I would love to hear it. I know my experience can't be the same experience for everyone, and if there's something I missed out on, I would love to hear it. And so, investing in the handful of experiences like renting e-bikes in the Grand Canyon were so worth it for us. And over the course of the trip, we spent $700.85. Not too shabby at all. Last but not least is the maintenance category. So like I said earlier, this van is practically new. We got it about 2 years ago, and this was our first extended trip. But like most RVers or van lifers know, things just break when you're in a moving vehicle. And that was our experience. We had a number of issues throughout our trip. Thankfully, that didn't ruin the trip, and we were still able to enjoy it. But our water pump broke, or at least so we thought. And it took us multiple visits to shops and troubleshooting to figure out that it wasn't actually a plumbing issue, it was actually an electrical issue, and it wasn't providing the right power to the water pump. Number of visits and hundreds of dollars later, we were able to resolve it. We also had another issue with our aftermarket deadbolts in our van that helped secure the doors. And so we had to go to Chicago and spend a day and about $500 repairing those parts. And so all in, for the total cost of the trip, we spent $1,497.33 on maintenance. This came out to about $15 per day. Now we are expecting the next trip to be a little bit less expensive in this category, but who really knows? I think this is an honest reflection that maintenance does happen in a van, as it would in any house too. So now that we've gone through all 5 categories, let's take a look at the total cost for the trip. So over the course of 103 days and the 11,500 plus miles that we drove, we spent $9,644.05. This is an average of $94 per day, or about $2,800 per month. Similar to some of the other categories, when I first looked at the total cost of the trip, I was a bit shocked. One, because we already own the van, and I thought this would be a little bit more inexpensive of a way to travel. I also didn't expect food to be so expensive. But then I started to put it into perspective, and I compared it to both what our ongoing normal monthly expenses are when we're home, and it's probably half of what our normal expenses are. Now, we're not including insurance and healthcare and some of the other ongoing expenses that we have, but it's still much smaller, in large part due to the low lodging and camping costs. So in that sense, we didn't spend that much on the trip. And in the other comparison, I also thought about how other people will take extravagant vacations and will often spend what we spent in 3 months in 2 weeks. And so if you put that into perspective as well, the $9,600 that we spent on this trip was well worth it, and we got to see so much for what we paid. And overall, we had an amazing trip. And so I'm really grateful that we had the opportunity to do that. And I'm looking forward to the many more trips in our future. We're going to continue to document our adventures on this channel, so make sure to hit that subscribe button. If you enjoyed this video and got a lot of value out of it, please hit that like button. Thanks for watching and enjoy the journey.